So since I bought my first Fuji camera this year, the X-T2, a lot of people have been asking me if I'm going to switch to Fuji this year. And as some of you may know, I've been a Canon shooter for the past few years, and before that I've shot with Nikon and Sony. But Canon was the brand that I kind of stuck with so far. Not necessarily because they were the best cameras, but they just seem to fit my personal needs the best. And I'm sure there's a little bit of brand loyalty involved, and I just seem to like their body design and lens design. And when I first started using Canon cameras, I had a very positive experience, and I just haven't really found any reason to switch out of them yet. And I've been really enjoying using my X-T2 for the past few months, but I never really bought this camera thinking that I'm gonna switch to Fuji from Canon. I mean, if I really wanted to, I probably could, because I know a lot of professional photographers use Fuji cameras, and why wouldn't they? Because they make great camera bodies and lenses. And although I haven't made the full switch yet, my Fuji actually has replaced my Canon gears, at least in things like street photography, travel photography, and any sort of casual shooting. And that has led me to buying the Fuji X-T3. I bought this camera for mainly two reasons. The first reason was to compare this with my X-T2, which has been a great camera. I've been enjoying using this. There was really no reason for me to look for a new camera, to be honest, but I was just kind of curious to see if the X-T3 was that much better. And pretty much the only reason why I didn't get the X-T3 in the first place was because the X-T3's been out for only about 7 or 8 months now. It's still a lot more expensive. I bought my X-T2 used for about $625, and right now, brand new, the X-T3 is about 2 or 2.5 times more expensive than a used X-T2, and I just didn't think it was worth the money. But after trying the X-T2 and seeing how good it was, I just wanted to see if I would like the X-T3 that much better. And I've also been getting a lot of questions from people asking me if they should get the X-T2 or the X-T3, or if they should upgrade to the X-T3 from the X-T2. So I just wanted to compare them in person and see how much better the X-T3 was. And the second reason why I bought this camera was obviously to compare this with my Canon gears. And like I said, I really didn't have any good reason to get rid of my Canon gears, but the Fuji's being smaller and lighter mirrorless cameras, obviously there are lots of benefits to that, and it's a camera that I can use every day pretty much for everything. So since it's a camera that I can take everywhere with me all the time, so why not just use this for my professional use as well and kind of simplify my gears. And there's actually one more reason why I bought this camera, and that was a much more selfish reason. There's really no logical way to put this. I just wanted to buy it. I just wanted to try it. I just wanted to get the latest and greatest. And perhaps the most importantly, Fuji has kept the design almost identical to the X-T2. There are some subtle differences here and there, but if you covered up the logo, it's almost an identical camera. And because of that, my wife has noticed that I bought a new camera. So thank you, Fuji, for keeping peace in our family. So yeah, those are the main reasons why I bought this camera, and also the past few weeks I've been getting more and more Fuji lenses as well. So after playing around with this for the past few days and comparing it with my X-T2 and my Canon gears, I think I have made up my mind about switching, and I'll let you know at the end of the video what I'm gonna do. And also just letting you know, as my other Fuji videos have been, this review is much more gonna be focused on photography, not video. I'm not really an expert video shooter, and I shoot videos for my YouTube channel, but I don't shoot any videos for clients. And my review of video capabilities of this camera would just be reading down the spec sheets. And I'm just kind of curious, what percentage of Fuji users do you think are video shooters? I mean, I'm not saying they don't exist, and like I said, they're great video cameras, but I'm just wondering, I'm just curious, how many people do you think buy an X-T3 just to shoot video? Like, if you're an actual professional videographer, wouldn't you just buy a Sony camera at this point? Let me know in the comments what you think. So as I mentioned, there's really not much difference in the body design, and some of the things that I noticed, the top dials are now slightly slanted instead of it being 90-degree angles on the X-T2. The diopter is now lockable, and the front and back dials now have much better feedback, although they do require a little more effort to turn them. Perhaps the biggest difference that I could actually call as an improvement is probably this release for the back screen. Now it is a button instead of being a latch, so I think that's a much nicer design. Some reviewers mentioned that the X-T3 body is slightly thicker, but I really don't feel the difference, and on the spec sheet I think it's about 1mm thicker, but I put the X-T2 grip on the X-T3 and it seems to fit just fine, so I don't think you're gonna notice the difference. Moving on to the sensor, now it has a 26 megapixel sensor instead of 24, 2 megapixels. You're really not gonna see any difference. Some reviewers said that the X-T3's low light performance is slightly worse, and based on my own extremely scientific testing, I couldn't really tell the difference, but what I do know is it's not any better either. So if you're debating about upgrading from the X-T2 because you're concerned about image quality, you're really not gonna see any difference there. The areas you'll see more improvements from the X-T2 are things like autofocus and frame rate. With things like autofocus, I feel like the X-T2 was already amazing in most cases. It did struggle a little bit in low light situations, but for things like tracking moving subjects or anything in decent lighting, I think it was already great. But the X-T3's autofocus system improves upon that even more. In pretty much any scenarios, it just seems to be a little more snappy and a little more sticky. And so far, the biggest difference that I saw was the face tracking in low light conditions. Combined with the eye autofocus, the X-T3's face tracking seems to track the subject a little better in low light situations. It's still not perfect and it's still not as good as Sony's. It only works well up to the range of maybe 10 feet. And when there's more than one person in the frame, it can be quite undecisive. But when I switch to single point focusing, it seems to be a lot more reliable. So if you're gonna be shooting a lot in low light, I would say do not rely too much on the face tracking. Now the X-T3 can shoot up to 11 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. The X-T2 could shoot 11 frames per second, but only in the boost mode, and to access the boost mode you needed the battery grip. But because of the new processor, the X-T3 now can access the boost mode and faster frame rate without the battery grip. So if you're gonna be using the battery grip anyway, it probably doesn't matter too much, but you probably buy cameras like the X-T3 because it's a smaller mirrorless camera, so there's no point putting a battery grip on it to make the camera bigger and heavier. So it's just nice that the X-T3 can do that without attaching a big battery grip. When you're shooting with the electronic shutter, there's an option to shoot at 20 frames per second without any crop, and when you're shooting at 30 frames per second, there's 1.25 times crop. So you do lose a little bit of the resolution, but if you're a sports and action shooter, I'm sure that's gonna come in handy someday. And as I just mentioned, the X-T3 now has a quad-core processor that's much more power efficient than the X-T2's dual-core processor. The battery life is slightly improved even though they share the same battery, maybe about 10 to 20%. I haven't really done the side-by-side testing with the battery life yet because since now you can shoot at much higher frame rate on the X-T3 and you can access the boost mode. And for those of you who don't know, the boost mode also improves autofocusing system. So when you're just comparing the number of shots fired per battery, you can get much higher numbers with the X-T3. And I heard even on the boost mode on the X-T3, the battery life is better than the normal mode on the X-T2. So that's a nice bonus. So even though you're not gonna see much difference in the body design and the image quality, the faster frame rate and the better autofocusing system and the better battery life might be good enough reason to switch for some of you. So obviously I've been doing a lot of testing since I got my X-T2 between my Fuji and Canon gears. So inevitably a lot of people have been asking me, and I've been asking myself this all the time, can I or will I switch to Fuji this year? Am I still in the honeymoon phase with my new cameras, or are Fuji cameras actually better? So here's what I know so far. The Fuji gears in general, Fuji cameras in general, I think look better. They're a little more fun to use. Obviously, they're much smaller and lighter, so they're much more suitable for travel. And despite the fact that they are APS-C cameras, they still produce great results. They make great lenses for their cameras. And I can totally see myself using the X-T3 for more and more serious work. With that said, every time I come back to my Canon cameras, I think there is a sense of comfort and there's a sense of familiarity. And I'm not just saying that because I've been using the Canon cameras longer, but the Canons being bigger cameras, they just seem to fit in my hands much nicer. I know where all the buttons are, and Canon is known for their extremely intuitive body design and the interface design. So the Fujis are prettier and the dials are much more fun to use, but with my Canons, I can change the settings much quicker. all the dials and buttons that I need fit in my reach perfectly. Everything's laid out perfectly for my hands. And in general, I'm just more of a function over fashion kind of guy, and when I don't need a smaller body, I still just seem to enjoy using the Canon more. And even though Fuji's are obviously great APS-C cameras, there are times that I still miss that full frame look. And Fuji makes great lenses, but you also cannot ignore the lens selection on the Canon side. And even when I'm using lenses like the 56 1.2, it is a great lens, don't get me wrong, but when I do the side-by-side comparison with my Canons, I always seem to prefer the Canon images more. And I just want to be very clear, the differences are probably negligible for most people, but it's a personal choice and I just seem to prefer the images from my Canon lenses and cameras. Also with the X-T3, just like how it was on the X-T2, anything shot at and above 6400 ISO seemed quite noisy. And you know, Canons nowadays are not exactly known for their image quality or like dynamic range or low light performance, but my 5Ds and EOS R being full frame cameras, I don't think Fuji's APS-C sensors are quite at the same level yet. So some might ask, if you want a small mirrorless full frame cameras, why don't you use Sony? Well, to be honest, I do think about that time to time, and I did used to shoot Sony, but here are some of the reasons why I don't use Sony. The first reason is, unlike Fuji cameras, them being full-frame cameras, Sony full-frame lenses tend to be very big and heavy. In most cases, they're just as big or even bigger than DSLR equivalents. So if I want a smaller camera overall, the Fujis make a lot more sense. Also, compared to my Canon lenses, Sony lenses tend to be a lot more expensive. Yeah, there are a lot of third-party options, but when you compare Sony and Canon lenses, the Canon lenses are a lot more affordable, and because Canon lenses have been around a lot longer, there is a much bigger used market as well. I don't want to make this video too much about Sony, but those are some of the reasons. So yeah, back to Canon and Fuji. So I think I do personally enjoy using the Fuji more, maybe about 75% of the time. But when I do want best of the best quality image that I can get, I think I still prefer to use Canon. And you know, image quality nowadays can be kind of subjective because pretty much all the cameras on the market are brilliant. And as long as you're not shooting anything in poor lighting, and as long as you're not a portrait shooter who shoots everything wide open, then you probably won't see the difference in most cases. So yeah, to summarize, if you're trying to decide between the X-T2 and the X-T3, if you're a photographer who's never used Fuji cameras before, I would say save some money and grab the X-T2, or a used X-T2, and get some extra lenses and just try it. See if you like it or don't like it. Yeah, the autofocus is better on the X-T3, but in most cases, the X-T2 will be more than good enough. And I don't think that's a good enough reason to pay that much more money for the X-T3 at this point. If you already have an X-T2 and thinking about upgrading to the X-T3, if you have the budget for it, and if you just simply want the latest and greatest, I would say go for it. There's no reason not to. The differences may not be big enough for most people for the price, but it is a better camera in almost every possible way. So again, if you have the budget for it, why not? So am I gonna fully switch to Fuji this year? Probably not. And I'm sorry, I know that might be a disappointing answer to some of you, but you know, that doesn't mean I'm gonna get rid of my Fuji gears. I'm gonna keep them all. And you know, I just like having options. And even though I think in most cases, I still prefer the images that I get from my Canon gears, at least now I'm confident enough that I can get the results that are just as good with a much smaller and lighter camera. You know, when I went to Korea and Japan 2 months ago, my X-T2 was my backup camera, but I know that if I were to take the same trip again next month, I can only just bring my X-T3 and that will be more than good enough for me. So let me know what you guys think. Are you a Canon user or are you a Fuji user? Sony, Nikon, Olympus, Panasonic, Leica? Let me know what you think about the X-T3, and that's gonna be it for me today. And thank you for watching as always. Bye bye.